a survey of almost 4,000 adults in the US. And so the main question we looked at was whether or not they thought that football, tackle football specifically, was an appropriate sport for kids to play. So kind of the main finding there is that while 45% of Americans did agree somewhat or strongly that it was appropriate, 50% disagreed somewhat or strongly that it was appropriate for kids to play, with the other 5% not knowing. So clearly it's a pretty contentious issue. People are pretty divided generally on whether or not they think that kids should be playing tackle football.
And what was the scale? Was there a neutral option available, or you had to agree or disagree?
So there wasn't a neutral option. Part of that is often if people are presented with a neutral option, that might be kind of the default to pick, even if it's not exactly what they think. People generally have a somewhat agree or a somewhat disagree. They generally lean one way or the other. So it was a 4 scale. It could be strongly disagree, somewhat agree, or strongly agree. Or you could pick that you didn't know or were unsure.
And Chris, whenever you guys did that, do you guys distinguish who is a kid? I mean, is it anybody under the age of 18, or is did you break it up into age groups?
Yeah, let me first offer a little bit of clarification of the previous question.
Yeah.
That is, so one thing we did is offer estimates of public opinion of U.S. adults, and in that analysis, to your question about whether people could choose not to agree or disagree, as Mariah noted, and I wanted to emphasize, people could respond that they don't know or they refuse to answer the question. And so when we calculated public opinion, then 5% of the people don't know, and then the rest fall along the lines of strongly agree to strongly disagree, with 50% essentially somewhat or strongly disagreeing, and 45% somewhat or strongly agreeing with tackle football being an appropriate sport for kids to play. And to your second question about how we frame the question, no, we purposefully left it open, although there's other research that informs how people think about the question. So we just use the language, do you think that football is an appropriate sport for kids to play? As you noted in your question, people might have different perceptions of what counts as a kid, right? What age groups. And some of the previous research that tracks participation actually finds that we've seen a particularly marked decrease in kids ages 6 to 12 playing tackle football. And also previous public opinion results have been more in agreement that football is risky for kids under the age of 13. And then we see kind of this interesting, paradox amongst kids, especially as they enter the teen years and into high school, in that adults continue to say that they recognize that football is a risky sport, but they are much more strongly in favor of kids playing, presumably because of the cultural and social status of high school football.
Also noticeable is that the issue is divided Americans by race and class. Can you guys touch on that a little bit, please?
Yeah, I can start. So on the question of divisions of class, first of all, so some of the reasoning we think behind that. So there is a noticeable difference. Wealthier folks of higher socioeconomic status are less likely to think that tackle football is appropriate for kids, whereas lower class folks are more likely to think that it's okay. So part of the theorizing behind that, football is a fairly inexpensive sport, especially in comparison to what we might call like country club sports like tennis or swimming. So it's more accessible to other people. People in general see stories of people coming from lower backgrounds and getting college scholarships. Football is a way to perhaps get yourself a higher education if you couldn't otherwise. So there's reasons that lower class individuals might continue to support football for kids when there's fewer options they think available for them, whereas higher status folks might have safer alternatives. They also are more likely to be aware of the health risks and know about them. And so they can think that children might be able to participate in other sports or other activities. And that class situation is tied up with the racial dynamics as well. So, Black Americans are more likely to be economically poorer as well. So those things are definitely all interrelated with each other.
So when you guys did the survey, when exactly did you do it, and did you make sure that there were not make sure, but were there equal representation of different races, genders, socioeconomic backgrounds, different things like that?
Yeah, so I was the principal investigator, the designer of the survey, and worked with some people at Ohio State, primarily from the Center for Human Resource Research. And what we did is we intended to get more representative demographic characteristics from people across the U.S. We ended up having to adjust a little bit and favored obtaining information from more adults than being able to emphasize the exact representativeness of the people who responded. And so what we do in this analysis and in other studies that use these data is that we match the information from census data with the characteristics of the people who answered our study. And especially because we have so many people, nearly 4,000 people who answered the study, we have a reasonable number of people from a variety of different subgroups. And in fact, our study is unusual in the fact that we can provide information from a host of people that are rarely interviewed. People, for example, who don't identify as heterosexual, and people who identify as non-binary in terms of their gender identities, as well as people from a host of different racial ethnic groups.
Was there anything that surprised you guys out of your survey results, and what was it? What do you find the most interesting or surprising?
I guess I'll go ahead. Based on prior information, in theory, a lot of the results I wouldn't say for me were surprising necessarily. We didn't necessarily have the numbers to back up things before the study, which is able to do that. But a lot of what we found, I think, is what we hypothesized to find. So maybe the most surprising thing is just that youth tackle football is so contentious and divided of an issue, when it seemed just a little cultural awareness that football is a very popular thing and everybody seems to love it for the most part. But when it comes to kids, things are a little different.
And I guess I would add what was most striking and maybe surprising to me was that we didn't find simple answers. We found a lot of different factors seem to combine with one another to really shape people's opinions about the suitability of tackle football for kids. So it wasn't just a race story, it wasn't just a gender story, although we certainly found that along with social class. We also found evidence that religion mattered and other indicators of traditionalism and being immersed in different football cultures and people's ideas of essentially the broader benefits of sports and the connections between sport and being an American. And so I think what's particularly striking is that we see basically the stacking of influence of a host of different social forces, primarily linked to people's backgrounds and their associations with different groups and ideologies associated with traditionalism, as well as beliefs about the value and promise of sport and their immersion in particularly football cultures.
Very interesting. I wanted to actually touch on one more thing, because I noticed that you said the different areas and people and different things like that. Something notable is I'm trying to find it here, that 27% to 39% higher for adults from the Midwest and South compared to those living in the West. Is that something that you mean there with different backgrounds and races and religions and different things like that?
Yeah, so a lot of those things are tied up with region and where you grow up and where you live. So football in certain parts of the country is more valued, it's more celebrated or important especially in the South and Midwest, in a lot of towns. You can think about like Friday night lights and the high school football game, being sort of the central like cultural activity for people that live there in the fall. Whereas in other parts of the country, like particularly the West, that's not necessarily the case. So when you grow up in the South or the Midwest, or you live there currently, kind of these like cultural scripts and what's important to you, are going to stick. And so it's football in those areas largely. So people in those areas are more likely to support it.
Oh, go ahead, Chris. Sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. Maybe I was going to add to Mariah's point, in that one neat thing that we're able to do with this analysis is that we work from the broader geographical and regional differences that you noted to looking at the extent to which more fine-tuned measures of the types of families that people grow up in and their personal experiences in playing football or being a football fan, and their notions about the value of sports and affinities for football specifically. And so, we're able to trace essentially these broad demographic differences, but then add evidence that really what's going on here is more of the types of cultures and interactions and groups that you're a part of. It's not just regional differences, but those regional differences play out on the micro level and even at the individual level with how people think about football and think about sport generally.
Are you guys going to be continuing to research this topic and perhaps, I don't know, draw any conclusions about what this means for the future of football? It still is America's most popular sport, but if you enjoy watching it on Saturdays and Sundays, and then you turn around and say, but not my kid, will there be as much football to watch on Saturdays and Sundays come 20, 30 years down the line?
Yeah, so it's obviously like a little bit hard to make predictions, but just looking at past trends, kind of like Chris had mentioned before, in the last like 10 years, participation has gone down over 20% for kids ages 6 to 12. So suggesting that fewer people are playing it. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be fewer people playing older years in high school or in college. So it doesn't perhaps tell us as much about what's going to happen at those higher levels. But we have seen different organizations and government groups even trying to popularize different types of football. So flag football, without tackling is a bit safer. So it does look like there's perhaps some changes there and what we try to make available for kids to play.
Yeah, and I would maybe add also other things we're thinking about both collaboratively and individually is going beyond just people's attitudes about football, but as Mariah alluded to, more specifically linking those attitudes to behaviors that occur subsequent of those attitudes. And so, to what extent do these attitudes affect what families do in terms of allowing or encouraging their kids to play football? And to what extent do people's opinions about football affect their personal behaviors of being fans or watching games, right? And so, some extensions of this work is to think not only how these attitudes matter, but then how playing different sports matter in different ways in people's lives and in the culture at large. Specifically, some of the interesting connections I think that I'm fascinated by with this research is connections to gender and sexuality and race and class that are evident in football and perhaps uniquely in football. And so we'd like to investigate those angles further.
Do you have anything to compare this to? Attitudes 10 years ago, perhaps?
Did you want to take that or you want me to take that?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I guess attitudes off the top of my head, I wasn't sure if you knew, Chris. Yeah, perhaps there hasn't, I guess a lot of people haven't necessarily looked at attitudes before, but we have those participation trends. So we can see in that sense that, football, especially for kids, was, more popular 10 years ago than it was today.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear that there is a growing resistance to the appropriateness of football for kids that correlates with the participation changes overall. But as Mariah said, one of the benefits, I think, of our research is that much of that work is focused on either philosophical or logical arguments, or has been inquiries from journalists who ask people about their personal experiences. And so, we add another contribution of evidence here in our study that suggests that essentially wariness of tackle football seems to be growing. So in the paper, we do cite some studies from the past 6 or 7 years, and it seems that the general trend is that people are becoming more disapproving of tackle football for kids, and we see that also reflected in medical professionals' recommendations to eliminate tackling for kids under the teenage years.
Okay, anything else that you guys would like to add that I may not have asked you?
You have anything?
That's always a good thing. I did my job.
Yeah, I think one thing that we didn't talk about so much, but I think is sort of fascinating, and it's been continually a part of debates about football, right? These debates about the appropriateness of football aren't necessarily new. 100 years ago, when Teddy Roosevelt particularly was president, there was concerns about people dying playing football, not kids per se, but college and older people. And so we've always had kind of this debate and disagreement about the appropriateness of the violence connected to football. And we continue to see really fault lines along people who think that we need to be tougher and also need to be more active, and also have really nostalgia for traditional notions and ways of doing gender, being particularly resistant towards people's pushes to maybe change the celebration of football in different ways, whether it's making it safer or eliminating it or encouraging people to play other sports or physical activities.